At the dawn of the 19th century, in a cellar in Mayfair, the most famous scientist of the time, Humphrey Davy, built an extraordinary piece of electrical equipment. 4 meters wide, twice as long, and containing stinking stacks of acid and metal. It had been created to pump out more electricity than had ever been possible before. It was, in fact, the biggest battery the world had ever seen. And with it, Davy was about to propel us into a new age. That moment would take place at a lecture at the Royal Institution in front of hundreds of London's great and good. Filled with anticipation, they packed the seats, hoping to witness a new and exciting electrical wonder. But what they would see that night would be something truly unique, something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Using just 2 simple carbon rods, Humphrey Davy was about to unleash the true potential of electricity. Electricity is one of nature's most awesome phenomena, and the most powerful manifestation of it we ever see is lightning. This is the story of how we first dreamed of controlling this primal force of nature, and how we would ultimately become its master. It's a 300-year tale of dazzling leaps of imagination and extraordinary experiments. Tens of thousands of volts passed across his body and through the end of a lamp that he was holding. It's a story of maverick geniuses who used electricity to light our cities, to communicate across the seas and through the air, to create modern industry, and to give us the digital revolution. But in this film, we'll tell the story of the very first scientists who started to unlock the mysteries of electricity. There's something alive in there. They studied its curious link to life, built strange and powerful instruments to create it, and even tamed lightning itself. It was these men who truly laid the foundations of the modern world. And it all started with a spark. Imagine our world without electricity. It will be dark, cold, and quiet. In many ways, it will be like the beginning of the 18th century, where our story begins. This is the Royal Society in London. In the early 1700s, after years in the wilderness, Isaac Newton finally took control of it after the death of his arch-enemy, Robert Hooke. Newton brought in his own people to the key jobs to help shore up his new position. The new head of demonstrations there was 35-year-old Francis Hawksby. Notes from the Royal Society in 1705 reveal how hard Hawksby tried to stamp his personality on its weekly meetings, producing ever more spectacular experiments to impress his masters. In November, he came up with this, a rotating glass sphere. He was able to remove the air from inside it using a new machine, the air pump. On his machine, a handle allowed him to spin the sphere. One by one, the candles in the room were put out. And Francis placed his hand against the sphere. The audience were about to see something amazing. Inside the glass sphere, a strange ethereal light began to form, dancing around his hand. A light no one had ever seen before.
Oh, that's fantastic. You see a beautiful blue glow. It's just marking out the shape of my hands, but then going right round the ball. It's as though there's something alive in there.
It's difficult to really understand why this dancing blue light meant so much. But we have to bear in mind that at the time, natural phenomena like this were seen to be the work of the Almighty.
This was still a period when, even in Isaac Newton's theory, God was constantly intervening in the conduct of the world. And so it made sense for a lot of people to interpret natural phenomena as acts of God.
So when a mere mortal meddled with God's work, it was almost beyond rational comprehension. Hawksby never realised the full significance of his experiment. He lost interest in his glowing sphere and spent the last few years of his life building ever more spectacular experiments for Isaac Newton to test his other theories. He never realised that he'd unwittingly started an electrical revolution. Before Hawksby, electricity had been merely a curiosity. The ancient Greeks rubbed amber, which they called electron, to get small shocks. And even Queen Elizabeth I marvelled at static electricity's power to lift feathers. But now, Hawksby's machine could make electricity at the turn of a handle, and you could see it. And perhaps even more importantly, his invention coincided with the birth of a new movement sweeping across Europe, called the Enlightenment. Enlightened intellectuals used reason to question the world, and their legacy was radical politics, iconoclastic art, and natural philosophy, or science. But ironically, Hawksby's new machine wasn't immediately embraced by most of these intellectuals, but instead by conjurers and street magicians. And those with an interest in electricity called themselves electricians. One story tells of a dinner party attended by an Austrian count. The electrician had placed some feathers on the table and then charged up a glass rod with a silk handkerchief. He then astonished the guests by lifting up the feathers with the rod. He then went on to charge himself up using one of Hawksby's electrical machines and gave the guests electric shocks, presumably to squeals of delight. But for his pièce de résistance, he placed a glass of cognac in the centre of the table, charged himself up again, and lit it with a spark from the tip of his finger.
There was a trick called the electrical beatification, in which the victim sits on an insulated chair, and above his head hangs a metal crown that doesn't quite touch his head. And then if the crown is electrified, then you get an electric discharge around the crown that looks exactly like a halo, which is why it's called the electric beatification.
As England and the rest of Europe went electricity crazy, the spectacles grew bigger. And the more curious electricians started to ask more profound questions. Not only how can we make our shows bigger and better, but how can we control this amazing power? And for some, can this incredible electrical fire do more than just entertain? One of the first early breakthroughs would never have happened had it not been for a terrible accident. This is Charterhouse in the centre of London. Over the past 400 years, it's been a charitable home for young orphans and elderly gentlemen. And sometime in the 1720s, it also became home to one Stephen Gray. Stephen Gray had been a successful silk dyer from Canterbury. He was used to seeing electric sparks leap from the silk, and they fascinated him. Unfortunately, a crippling accident ended his career and left him destitute. But then he was offered a new life here at Charterhouse, and with it, the time to perform his own electrical experiments. Here at Charterhouse, possibly in this very room, the Great Chamber, Stephen Gray built a wooden frame. From the top beam, he suspended 2 swings using silk rope. He also had a device like this, a Hawksby machine, for generating static electricity. Now, with a large audience in attendance, he got one of the orphan boys who lived here at Charterhouse to lie across the 2 swings. Gray placed some gold leaf in front of him. He then generated electricity and charged the boy through a connecting rod. Gold leaf, even feathers, leapt to the boy's fingers. Some of the audience claimed they could even see sparks flying out from his fingertips. Show business indeed. But to the curious and inquiring mind of Stephen Gray, this said something else as well. Electricity could move. From the machine to the boy's body, through to his hands. But the silk rope stopped it dead. It meant the mysterious electrical fluid could flow through some things, but not through others. It led Gray to divide the world into 2 different kinds of substances. He called them insulators and conductors. Insulators held electric charge within them and wouldn't let it move, like the silk, or hair, glass and resin, whereas conductors allowed electricity to flow through them, like the buoy, or metals. It's a distinction which is still crucial even today. Just think of these electric pylons. They work on the same principle that Gray deduced nearly 300 years ago. The wires are conductors. The glass and ceramic objects between the wire and the metal of the pylon are insulators that stop the electricity leaking from the wires into the pylon and down to the earth. They're just like the silk ropes in Gray's experiment. Back in the 1730s, Gray's experiment may have astounded all who saw it, but it had a frustrating drawback. Try as he might, Gray couldn't contain the electricity he was generating for long. It leapt from the machine to the boy and was quickly gone. The next step in our story came when we learnt how to store electricity. But that would take place not in Britain, but across the Channel in mainland Europe.
across the Channel, electricians were just as busy as their British counterparts, and one centre for electrical research was here in Leiden, Holland.